All right, so I hope you all enjoyed the lunch break and discovering Manly. Now we move on to our afternoon session, and we start with the great Andrew Howe. He needs no introduction. I think most people know who Andrew is. Obviously, one of the great stats men of our time, all statistics, and that's what we're here to talk today. So, Andrew Howe, Data Talks, Diversity by Numbers. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Now, it's a very visual presentation, so feel free to get into a better viewing position. And I'll get cracking. So, we like to think the elite level of our game, so the level that our professionals play, the level that our kids aspire to, and the level that we as fans watch, we like to think it's diverse. The international dimension of Australia's national leagues is something we can learn from, we can be proud of, and we can promote. But how diverse are our leagues? How many of our national league players actually came from abroad? And do they really come from a wide range of countries and cultures, as the term diversity suggests? So, as I've already been introduced, Andrew Howe is my name, stats is my game, and let me answer these questions now with data. But also give you a little taste of these players, who they were. There's some really good stories there that I hope some budding writers might be able to follow up on. Okay, so first, as like any good demographer, I need to define the study population, which are players from Australia's National League. So after the most recent A-League season, we now have 64 seasons of men's and women's National League player data to play with. Starting from that first NSL season in 1977, there have been 43 men's seasons, 21 women's seasons, with the first women's NSL competition starting in 1996. In all, 4,655 players have made at least one appearance in our National League. So that's a population about the size of Gerringong, if you know that town on the New South Wales south coast. All up, these players have played a combined almost 17 million minutes, 282,000 hours of National League football. Now, with its earlier start, more teams, longer seasons, the men's contribute the vast majority of these players, 80% of these players. And on screen now, I've got how that population, our study population, has increased over time. So in 1984, we reached 1,000 players. By 1995, we reached 2,000. And with the creation of the Women's League, since then, it's helped us grow to that over 4,600 National League players. Average age of men's players is 25.7, and it's now 2 years older than what it was when the competition started in 1977, which is actually a lot. It's ageing a lot less than the Australian population. In recent seasons, the ageing slowed down. Our female National League players are younger. However, there's been a more rapid ageing of W League players, reflecting, I think, growing maturity and professionalism in that competition. Okay, so I'm classifying each player. I've classified each player into an Australian-raised or an overseas-raised player, and it's basically based on where that player lived up until I've created a cut-off of their teenage years. Now, for most players, it's a pretty clear-cut distinction whether you're raised overseas or not. So I'm not defining it purely on birthplace because a lot of players move here very young and don't get that football experience in their birth nation. And for older players, obviously, they've migrated here, say in their 20s or 30s, or moved here temporarily when they haven't developed. Then they haven't developed into that elite player within Australia. So they learnt their football in those critical development years, in the teenage years, in another country. And it's from these source countries they bring their knowledge and experience that I'm assessing here in terms of our leagues. So they include one-off players, one-off guest players, and those hundreds of players who have settled down in Australia, often ending up as coaches or as parents of elite players themselves. Okay, so based on this definition, I've got 33% of all National League players were raised overseas. And these players have played a combined 28 minutes, so a little bit lower there. So it's saying that overseas raised players have shorter National League careers than their Australian-raised teammates. And yeah, a little bit of history. So the first 3 NSL seasons, over half of our players were raised overseas. So season 1 in 1977 had 55% of its players raised overseas. So it was a very imported new league in a sense. Teams such as Heidelberg, Canberra City, Brisbane Lions, 70% of their initial squads were overseas raised. Then we had a fairly steady decline over the next 20 seasons. There's a graphic on the screen now showing this decline, getting to a minimum of 11% players being overseas raised in 95. And then with the A-League kicking off in 2005, we've seen an increase in those overseas players in terms of the proportion of that population. So now 1 in 5 A-League players are overseas raised, been quite steady over the last 5 years. So the W League has a slightly smaller share of its players from overseas now. However, there has been a big increase from 12 years ago when the W League started. And in recent seasons, about 1 in 5 W League players were imported from abroad. And here's a good time to point out that the women's NSL before 2005 was essentially state academy and institute-based, meaning there were hardly any overseas raised female players playing National League level in Australia until the W League started. Okay, some numbers now. We're talking a total of just over 1,500 overseas raised players, with 8 in 9 of those being men's league players. Over time, the shape of this numbers chart now looks similar to the percentages chart showed you before. There was a peak in 1984, was our peak year of overseas players, and that's when we had 24 teams, 2 lots of 12-team divisions. The presence of a New Zealand-based men's team since 1999 has pushed numbers up a bit over the last 20 years, and there was also a bit of a jump in 2009. A couple of A-League teams joined. Now, the W League, with its high reliance on imports, especially over the past 5 years, has added another 200 overseas raised players to the tally. Over time, the average age of men's overseas players is 28, although in recent years it's closer to 30 years old. And over all men's seasons, players raised overseas are on average 3.5 years older than their locally raised players. So the local players, who we like to think are the ones who learn from the overseas players, their overseas teammates are clearly younger. There's a similar differential with the W League that in that overseas raised women's players are around 4 years older on average, but that gap has actually come down in the last couple of years. Okay, so how diverse is this huge population of overseas raised players? What countries and cultures and influences did they bring to Australia? Okay, so I'm defining this concept of nationality based on where they were raised, based on, as I said before, which country they spent most of their time until their teenage years. And I've done this based on current FIFA countries. So it just makes it easier to analyse, easier to map when you do that. So what it means is, for example, is that I've Balkanised players from the former Yugoslavia. It was a lot of fun. So Yugoslavia, which existed as one country until the early 90s, I've categorised them basically into current countries. So for those who know their Aussie Yugoslav football history, this was how most players from that region were regarded by their Balkan contemporaries in Australia throughout the 70s and 80s. They may have moved here from Yugoslavia, but they were Croatian, they were Serbian, Macedonian, generally speaking. Okay, so where have these 1,500 plus players come from? We'll get some moving maps happening now, which I hope work. So in addition to the 3 Icelandic players and around 30 Scandinavians, we've had almost 600 players from the UK and Ireland. So 40% of our overseas raised players are from the British Isles, including about 300 English and 220 Scots. There have been around 44 Dutch, 22 Germans, 11 Poles, 4 Slovaks, no Czechs, plus several Austrian, Swiss, French players. We've seen similar numbers of Spanish and Italian players, exactly the same actually at this point in time, same numbers there. But whereas the Italians were spread fairly evenly over the 44 years, Spanish have been a more recent thing. I'll talk a bit more about that later. The nations of former Yugoslavia have been a prominent source, especially the Serbs, the Croats and the Macedonians. I only know of 1 solitary Turk, 1 Cypriot, Sydney Olympic player Savas Kartambis played in the first NSL season. A handful of players from the Middle East, including 2 Israeli men and 1 Israeli woman, Lee Falcon. I've got 40 players who grew up in the various regions of Africa. So with Ghanaians, Nigerians and South Africans, the most prominent. All up, I've got players from 16 different African countries, from Morocco in the north down to South Africa, Cape Verde in the Atlantic Ocean in the west, to Mauritius in the east. In the Indian Ocean. Okay, zooming across to Eastern Asia, the most prominent Asian players have been from Korea, almost 20, South Korea, just ahead of Japanese, and less than 10 Chinese players. Zooming down through Oceania, there have been plenty of Kiwis, of course, around 150 in fact, although a lot of seasons early on, hardly any New Zealand players. We've had plenty of South Americans going all the way back to the start of the NSL. So in the first, all up, a combined 100 Argentinians and Brazilians have played in national leagues. And then whizzing up through Central America, we've had Panamanians, we've had Costa Ricans, we've had plenty from the USA and Canada. The United States has been by far the biggest importer of players in the W League. We'll likely hit an aggregate 100 US imports in the W League in the upcoming season. Okay, so there's a map on the screen now showing that over the 44 years, 85 different nationalities have played in our National League, again, based on this concept of overseas race players that I've created for this study. So the most recent addition was Mexico, when Wellington Phoenix has played Ulises Davia last season. And yeah, in just 12 seasons, the W League has seen 29 different nationalities. Okay, in the first season, there were 22 nations represented, including 15 European nationalities, again, based on today's borders. So British Isles players contributed, were prominent in almost all of the inaugural 14 NSL teams. Well, basically, they were all Scots and English. 3/4 of season 1 imports. Outside of the traditional source countries of the UK and the Balkans, we had 8 Argentinians in that first NSL season, several Brazilians, a couple of South Africans, an Angolan, a Fijian, and 1 New Zealander. Okay, and just sort of stepping back for a minute. So we're talking 44 years ago. How was Australia looking as a population? How had we been progressing in terms of numbers? So yeah, on the eve of the 77 NSL, we had a census which showed the population was 14 million. That had almost doubled since the end of World War II. And on the back of large-scale immigration from countries impacted by the war. So from 10% overseas born just after the war, by 1976, 1 in 5 Australians, or 20%, were born overseas. And it was migration from the British Isles that was particularly strong. So the UK and Ireland-born population had increased by more than 100% in less than 3 decades. So now, 44 years later, and not only has Australia's population almost doubled again, but that proportion of overseas raised continues to rise substantially. On the screen, I've got 30% now of Australians are born overseas. However, it's not as much from the British Isles migrants in more recent times, but from a much wider range of countries. And so looking back to our player nationalities in the most recent league seasons, we can see a much bigger and broader range of countries represented in the players. So in the A-League, it took just 10 A-League seasons to surpass the total number of nationalities that we saw in 28 seasons of the NSL. Okay, let's look at some individuals. And yeah, I'd love to talk about all 1,500, but yeah, I'll whiz through the individuals, and there's some video here that I hope works. So English players, 303, I reckon. Most famous is probably Bobby Charlton. He played a couple of games in the NSL in the early years. He played for England, obviously, for over 100 caps, including the 1966 World Cup, and 600 games or so for Manchester United. Kevin Keegan, he played here. He played a couple of games for Blacktown in 1985. Liverpool legend there. His second game was at Marconi Stadium, we were talking about earlier, Marconi Stadium, Remo. 14,000 people went to see that game. I just can't imagine that many people being in that compact stadium. Emil Heskey, Leicester City and Liverpool player, 62 caps. He, of course, played more recently in the A-League for Newcastle Jets. Other English players with more than 50 caps include Ray Clements, who actually just passed away last week, Peter Beardsley, Trevor Francis, actually a quick quiz question. All right, so the overseas race player with the most games, there was an overseas race player, and let's exclude New Zealanders for a minute, who played the most games, not only played the most NSL games, but scored the most NSL goals. Does anybody know who that is? Australian National League game, yeah. Not quite, no. I'm not giving you any more clues, sorry. It was Francis Oratifi. Yeah, yep. So, shout out to Franny there. Okay, Scottish players. Dixie Deans, he played for Celtic. He was the NSL's first top scorer in the first season there. He played for Adelaide City. Graham Souness, he played a few games for West Adelaide back in the day. Liverpool and Middlesbrough player. Eddie Thompson, who went on obviously to become a prominent Socceroos coach, almost got us to the 1994 World Cup. More recent Scots include Ross McCormick and Rachel Corsie, who's played over 100 times for the Scotland national team, women's national team. And a quick another chart there, we see the initial abundance and then the drop-off of English and Scots players. So I've got a graphic on the screen there showing that in the early NSL seasons, lots of English and Scots. Throughout the 80s, it really dropped off. But there's still a fair few, significant numbers in most recent seasons. Okay, from elsewhere in the British Isles, George Best is on the screen. Northern Ireland player there. Terry McFlynn, another one. Aaron Hughes, over 100 times he played for Northern Ireland. Welsh players on the screen. I've got Jess Fishlock, who was the first Welsh player to play over 100 times for the national team, their national team. Captain coach of Melbourne City. Ian Rush was another one. He had a short stint with Sydney Olympic. And recent players from Ireland include Roy O'Donovan and Damien Duff, who I've got on the screen. 100 league appearances in England, over 100, or exactly 100 caps, I think, for the Ireland national team. Okay, in the NSL's early years, there were a few prominent players who grew up in Serbia. All up, I've got 68 or 69. players raised in Serbia, including Doug Utjesenovic, who's on the screen. Zoran Matic was another prominent one in the early years who went on to coach. In the 80s, there was 20-year-old Footscray guest player Vlado Stosic, who later appeared for Red Star Belgrade in its Euro Cup final win in 1991 against Marseille. Milan Ivanovic, another prominent Serbian-raised player, ended up playing 300 times in the NSL despite coming to Australia. He was almost 30 when he came here. More recently, there's been Bobby Despotovski and Milos Ninkovic, of course, current player, and the first W League player from the Balkans in Milica Mijatovic, played for Melbourne City last season. Croatians, 46 in total I've got. And the Croatians especially came to prominence with the entry of the Sydney and Croatia NSL clubs in 1984. One notable Croat was Vedran Rosic, who's on the screen. And his move from the then Yugoslavia to Australia was actually delayed by the Yugoslav government, who considered the Sydney Croatia Soccer Club as a terrorist organisation. It's amazing, fascinating story. There's stories from back then. So they stopped him at the border, basically. He eventually made his way here to play for and coach Sydney Croatia and guided a lot of players, Graham Arnold, Robbie Slater, Wally Sharvor, a lot of players played under Rosic. Another victim of crazy Balkan politics was Drago Dijankovic from the Slavonian region of Croatia. He played for Osijek over there. Now he moved... his first club was Melbourne, Croatia, and then he made the mistake of moving to the big rivals, Footscray JUST. His house was firebombed and gutted, and as was the Footscray coach, Alf Bulic. Crazy times. Standout Croats in terms of long careers in Australia include Branko Milosevic, Josip Biskic, Velimir Kupršak. From elsewhere in the former Yugoslavia, we had several talented Macedonians. Žako Odzakov on the screen, Zoran Tasevski, played for Preston, Zlatko Nastevski is another Macedonian. Players from Bosnia include Alex Djuric, and on the screen I've got Josif Hatunic, played for Sloboda Tuzla, Partizan Belgrade, played for the Yugoslav national team, and actually died quite young, sadly. And the most prominent player from Kosovo, Besart Berisha. Although probably, based on this definition I was talking about before, Berisha actually moved from Pristina to Germany, 5 or 6 years old. So probably should be classifying him as Germany. But proud Kosovar. Really interesting. When this job of categorising players. This guy was born in what was then Yugoslavia, in the province of Kosovo. Which has in the meantime become a country according to FIFA. Raised in Germany, as I said. Played for the Albanian national team. Albanians, Kosovars, quite close there. And lives in Australia now, so I love it. Okay, Italians. Despite the strong influence of Italian migrants in Australia, not many players actually stayed in Australia for more than a year or so. Just one in 1977. I've got some video on the screen now showing Marconi's Roberto Vieri. He actually fathered two prominent international players. And Christian Vieri, played for Italy, and Australian Max Vieri. Francesco Graziani, he played 2 games for Apia Leichhardt in 1988. On the screen I've got some footage of of one of those games, which was the very first game I ever went to as a spectator. So I still love seeing footage of Lambert Park in 1988. So he won a World Cup with Italy, as did, of course, Alessandro Del Piero, a more recent player, obviously. Played for Sydney FC not too long ago. So some big names there from Italy, including the most recent Player of the Year, Men's Player of the Year, Alessandro Diamanti. The Greeks, peak Greek was 1977, 78, 6 players in each of those seasons, including my favourite Greek in Ulisses Kokinos. I've got a photo of Ulisses on the screen there, and I've got this fantastic article from a 1977 1976 Soccer World magazine, and there's a couple of quotes in this magazine that are too small for me to read, but I took a photo before. So yeah, a couple of quotes from this magazine. So here was the NSL's first sex symbol. And in this story from 1976, I've circled some bits. Kokkinos has said there's nothing as beneficial to a player as sex before the game. My ideal Saturday night before a game is to relax, have dinner with a nice girl and have sex. But I don't believe in going out drinking. And last little quote, I prefer the sensible type of girl and I prefer the European born. So that's Ulysses Kokkinos, my favourite Greek NSL player. Okay, Kostakouis, he was a legend at Aris Salonika and the old Greek Macedonian a player there. Played a few games for Heidelberg in 1989. He wanted to stay a little bit longer, but his club wouldn't let him. And then it took another 30 years for a Greek-raised player to play in Australia, Panagiotis Kone, who was actually born in Albania, but yeah, moved to Athens quite young, played for Olympiakos youth team. Elsewhere in Europe, yeah, look, I'll just whiz through some countries here. We've had some Finns, we've had 9 Swedish, mostly NSL, WWL players. Norwegians include Lisa Marie Woods, who played for Adelaide United. She in Perth Glory. Denmark, we've had 18 players, including who I'm pretty sure is the most experienced senior international to play in Australia. I've got a photo of Katrina Pedersen on the screen there. Over 200 national team games. It's a huge number. She played for Adelaide United. Although Ariane Hinkst, a German player, is not far behind in terms of caps, 180 caps for Germany. Other Germans include Brisbane Roar players Nadine Angerer and of course Thomas Broich. Yeah, we've had Poles. We've had Polish players include Bogdan Bonk. The Polish Rifle was his name. I love that name, Bogdan Bonk. He came here, played for North Geelong and then Melbourne, Croatia. Played him for a year or two. We've had Austrians, including Mark Janko, Dutch, 43 Dutch, including Patrick Svanswijk, oldest grand final winner in Australian National League history. The first of 5 Belgians on the screen there is Pierre Essers. So this guy's NSL career lasted 2 minutes. He played for Newcastle in 1992. Okay, so Dave saw those 2 minutes. Great. 2 minutes before succumbing to calf injury, and that was his career. French, we've had about a dozen French players. The French are interesting because there's a lot of dual nationality players who have come from France, which I think reflects multicultural France today, basically. Most famous, I reckon, is Fahid Ben Khalfallah, often touted as a Tunisian. Well, he played for Tunisia, but he's never lived there. He's a French national. Grew up in France. Okay, Spanish players. That's, interesting demographic here. So I've got 32 Spanish players all up. But yeah, the first one only came 2011, or ones, Danny Sanchez and Olga Cebrian Garcia. And since then we've had 30 more Spanish players, with more signed for the upcoming season. Yeah, it's not stopping the Spanish influx. So yeah, Spanish are interesting, as I say. Like, not really a big migrant group historically, despite there was the countries that were slammed in European countries with World War II. Spain had its carnage in Spain in the 30s, and I'm thinking, I've been meaning to look this up actually, like in terms of those emigres, moving out of Spain. I think the Spanish more went to South America rather than Australia and New Zealand. I guess the language issue there has also helped them settle more in South America rather than Australia. But yeah, in more recent years, the Spanish financial crisis, 2008, has probably led to Spanish players coming here in the meantime. Maltese import, Michael Mifsud, has the most senior national team appearances of any Australian National League player. He played his record 140 men's National League player, I think I said. Played his record 143rd and last game for Malta just last week, and he actually scored in that game. Americans, or from the Americas, we've had a few Brazilians, 58 in total, especially in the first few seasons, including Socceroo Agi Munoz. There was an influx of Brazilians around 2007 to 2012. We maxed at about 13 Brazilians for a couple of seasons there. Argentines, we've had 42 players from Argentina, including World Cup winner Ozzy Ardiles. He played a game for St. George in 1985. Uruguayans include Washington Gonzalez. He played for Melita for ages. He was actually in the Uruguay team who defeated Brazil in 1983 Copa America. Costa Ricans include Jerry Gomez, photo on the screen there. Moved to Australia aged 17, played over 300 NSL games and won a record 5 championships. 99 US players in total, including Lauren Barnes on the screen, 4 WWL championships. Played for both the Melbourne clubs. Megan Rapinoe won 2 World Cups, so I'm pretty sure that's the record for any player who's played in Australia, and an Olympics gold medal. Another Sydney FC player was Sonia Huerta, who played for both the United States and the Mexican national teams. Despite being part of the Asian Confederation now, there hasn't really been many Asians who have played in Australia, Asian race players. Players from Western Asia were actually first. Iranians Karim Ghazi and Hussein Husseini played in the NSL's early years. They both moved to Sydney with a wave of Iranian migrants back in the 70s. From the east of the continent, we've had around 20 players from Korea. On the screen, I've got Tae-Young Shin. He played for Brisbane Roar in its first season, just one game, and then he moved on to coaching. In the meantime, he's won an Asian Champions League. He took South Korea to the World Cup, the Men's World Cup, and he's currently coaching the Indonesian national team. The first of 17 Japanese players came in the year 2000, and since then we've had Shinji Ono, and on screen is Kazu Miura, who's still playing. Amazing, 53 years old. There have been 4 Japanese W League players, including Yukari Kinga, who's played over 100 times for the Japanese national side. Only been 8 Chinese players who mostly came for brief stints. From Africa, in the first few NSL seasons, there was Angolan Lopez Manicas, who started out with Sydney City before moving to West Adelaide. Cape Verde player Simeo Antonio played for Sydney City, and there was a Gary Clayton from Zimbabwe. Ghanaian Ransford Benini on the screen. He played on for several years in Australia after playing in the 1993 World Youth Cup final. Ghana against Brazil. I remember that game. It was an amazing game, Sydney Football Stadium. There's also been a sprinkling of players from Nigeria, Liberia, while the most experienced African international to play here is Rifilo Jane, played 100 times for the South African national side. And I hope you can see video here, because my favourite African-raised National League player is this guy. His name is Ferdy Adebowie. He played for St. George in 1989. Now, this guy, if you go to the Guinness World Records, he holds the world record for running 100 metres the fastest out of everyone in the world. 100 metres, he has run the fastest. 100 metres backwards, that is. Yep. So there's video footage of this guy's 12.7 second 100 metre backwards sprint. Did you know that the world's fastest backward running player played for St. George in 1989? Okay, from the Oceania region, Fijian Kenny Kowaleva played for Canberra City in the first season, 77. Roy Krishna is a more recent A-League Player of the Year. We've had a couple of players move from Papua New Guinea down to Brisbane, including Manis Lamond. Lawrence Drake was another New Guinea-born raised player, and of course New Zealand's feature strongly, especially since the late 90s with 1990s when Auckland Football Kings came in. Excuse me, they're all up. I've got 135 male and 17 female players from New Zealand, including Vaughan Coveney, who's has the most Australian National League players of any overseas raised player, and is Oceania Player of the 20th Century. Winton Ruffer, born to a Swiss mother and a Swiss father and Maori mother. Okay, so in terms of men's players of the year, I've got a list on screen. So even though players raised overseas contribute just a third of all players, they have comprised almost 2/3 of players of the year. So the first 3 players of the year was Jimmy Rooney, born or raised in Scotland, and then the next 2 was Kenny Bowden, played for Newcastle, English player, and Bosnian Croat Ivor Prskalo, 3rd player of the year. In the late 80s, early 90s, we had the trifecta of the main Balkan countries with Macedonian Zlatko Nastevski, Croatian magician Željko Adzic, and Milan Ivanovic taking out the best player titles 3 seasons running. So each of these players, I've got photos on the screen now, ended up playing for Australia. Nastevski, it was like half a game or so, and he went down with a crippling injury that effectively ended his first-class playing career. Playing for Australia was when that happened. Sadly, Željko Adzic, he played for Australia as well. I think it was against Malmo in 1990. He actually when he went back home to Croatia, I meant to check this. I'm pretty sure he's the player who scored the first goal for the newly independent Croatian national side in the early 90s. And Milan Ivanovic, of course, 70 times he ended up playing for Australia, including as captain. And Alessandro Diamanti, I got him on the screen there, was the popular men's player of the year last season. Now, what's really striking about this list of recent men's players, I've got the list of the last 10 or so, or 10 of the last 11 players of the year in the men's league were from overseas. So what's so striking about this is how geographically diverse their countries of origins are. And then when you add the last 2 W League players of the year, Christine Nan and Kristen Hamilton, we've got almost every FIFA confederation covered. Okay, so obviously these players of the year are more the outliers. So good imports are generally chosen on purpose and often don't stick around. So in trying to measure the success of all overseas raised players, I've calculated their career win-loss ratios in all National League games. So the win-loss ratio, I think it's a simple, but it's an effective way of measuring overall performance. You've got a ratio of 1. Above 1, you've won more than you've lost. Below 1, you've lost more than you won. And overall, overseas raised players have a win-loss ratio close to 1. They win a similar amount of games than they lose, so not very exciting. But when we combine player appearances for the most popular nationalities, I think we get some more interesting stats. And on the screen, I've got that German imports are the most successful in terms of this win-loss ratio. I've pulled out. There's a footnote there saying at least 500 starting appearances. You get some wonky figures when you look at small numbers here. So yeah, look, I think we've got a good base population here to say that the Germans are the most successful in terms of this ratio, followed by the Croatians and Brazilian players. W League, United States players have a win-loss ratio just above 1.04. Other countries combined a little bit lower. So another way of measuring the overall effectiveness of these players is to consider games where there are more overseas raised players in one team than the other. So on the screen, I think it was a random pick of a game last year. I've got Western United against Newcastle Jets. So Western United had 4 overseas race players, Newcastle none. So yeah, do those teams with more overseas race players win or lose more? So the overall win-loss ratio in the A-League for teams which have more overseas raised players than their opponents is 1.14. So it's basically saying, based on all results today, 14%, you're more likely to win. Or teams with more overseas players win 14% more times than they lose. And a variation on this aspect, does more diversity win more? So again, the Western United Newcastle game there, I've got 5 nationalities for Western United on that night, 1 for Newcastle Jets. Do these players which have the more nationalities win more, or do they lose more? I've got a win-loss ratio of 1.16 in the A-League for those more diverse teams. All right, I'll whiz through the rest. Nationalities. Okay, so on the screen, I've got a map of these 85 nationalities of Australian National League players based on where they were raised and initially developed as footballers. Now, there's other aspects of nationality or ethnicity we can give to our players, such as countries represented. So there's several Australians that fall into this category. Buddy Farah played for Lebanon. Australians. Brendan Garn played for Malaysia. And Anita Burgess called up for the Philippines. So if we add these countries to the mix, I've got another 16 countries that are represented. And then there's, well, the birthplace itself, what countries these players were born. We get another, well, combined using these 3 concepts I've got on the screen, 120 different countries represented. So yeah, I think this map really shows the diversity of football at top level in Australia. And I guess what's also just as interesting from this map are the exclusions. So yeah, there's still some parts of Africa. There's a couple of holes in Europe. No Czechs. The Czechs had their time before the NSLs in the 50s and especially the 60s. A lot of Czech players made it big time in Australia. Bulgaria is another hole, a country that we don't really. There's not a big inflow of Bulgarians over the decades. Arabian Peninsula, Central Asian republics, and then in the Southeast Asian region, where we do have more of those cultural ties. We don't tend to have those as much with the those other Arabian Peninsula countries, for example. So not as many players from that region, that part of the world, have played at National League level. And what would fill this map out even more is if we could include the ancestries of players. So just like the broader Australian population, our already diverse National League players have an even wider range of ancestries and ethnicities through their parents, including several from Southeast Asia. So the number of A-League players with parents born in Africa has exploded recently. So I reckon we've got 45 players who have played in the A-League with African ancestry, with more destined to make their debut next season. And speaking of ancestry and diversity, the number of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander National League players is low, albeit prestigious. On the screen, we've got Harry Williams, Bridget Starr, played in the first men's and women's National League seasons. Jade North, Lydia Williams up there as well. So I've got 20 Indigenous players in my database. I think there's more. Surely I'm missing some. And yeah, because I just haven't been able to get the data, the information on Indigenous status. And it's a similar data problem that makes ancestry difficult to include in my database. It'd be great if clubs increase this type of information for their players on their websites or just at hand to have to media by including ancestry to the same prominence as, just a basic stat like a birthplace or a birth date or a position. Because demonstrating that our league's true diversity is something we should all be doing more of. A healthy number and range of overseas influences helps our game learn and grow by rubbing off on our younger local players and by creating a more attractive product. And this diversity lets us promote and be proud of a truly cosmopolitan competition. Thanks.